So first off, let me say that this particular lesson was actually done a couple of weeks ago at the building where we assemble, where our congregation assembles. And somehow, in my attempts to set the recording up at the building there, I managed to get the record button on but hit the mute button. So we were unable to actually deliver a video and sound version of this particular lesson to put online. So I have decided to come back and to make up for that. And this is actually part one of what was released last Sunday. And so we're going to begin simply by reading from the Gospel of Mark, verses 27 through 30. It says, "Now Jesus and his disciples went out to the towns of Caesarea Philippi, and on the road he asked his disciples, saying to them, 'Who do men say that I am?' And they answered, 'John the Baptist, but some say Elijah, and others one of the prophets.' And he said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' And Peter answered and said to him, 'You are the Christ.' Then he charged them that they should tell no one about him." And so the first thing that it would be interesting to look at, or I thought that we could do, is to learn from some of the questions that were not asked. We've talked a lot of times in the past, and I'm sure I've mentioned in the past, that we learn a lot by asking questions. Sometimes we can learn specific things by which particular questions aren't asked. And so I wanted to start this particular set of lessons off with the idea of what it is, first of all, are some of the things that he didn't ask. One of the things that he didn't ask is, what do people think of my teaching? And this would have been a great question, because we understand that people have come from all over to hear him. It seems like everywhere he goes, great crowds gather, and they come to hear him speak, and they come to see him perform miracles as well. But we understand that a big part of their showing up was for the opportunity to hear him teach. And so certainly there would be things that were being said. Certainly people had to be talking about what they were hearing. And the question would encompass, and it would be a good question for learning information if a preacher were to ask that type of question. They might ask, what do people think of my teaching? And it would then give them an idea of whether or not people are understanding what's being said, whether people are agreeing or disagreeing with what's being said. And so this would have been a very good question for him to bring up. And it certainly would have been a very timely question for him to ask, as he has been doing a great deal of teaching. We understand, as I just mentioned, that people were coming from all over the world to hear Jesus teach. And people today actually appreciate the various aspects of teachings attributed to Jesus as well. You will hear people talk about the idea of some of the things that Jesus taught and some of the things that he expressed, and they will use them in their teaching as well. Now, they're not necessarily going to give him credit for who he is. They're not actually giving credit necessarily to the one doing the teaching, but many people in the world today appreciate some of the ideas and some of the concepts and some of the things that Jesus went about teaching. And so many people today may ask the question, or we may ask the question, what are people saying about his teaching today? And that might be a very good question to gain information. But that's not where Jesus wanted to go at this particular point. You'll also notice that he didn't ask, what are people saying about my miracles? And I had mentioned that people would come from all over, and they would come for a couple reasons. Sometimes they would be different, sometimes it would be both. But they would come to hear him teach, and they would come to see him perform miracles. And up to this point, we've seen that he's performed many miracles, and there have been very many different reactions to it. Some claim that he is or believe that he is able to do these things through the power of Beelzebub. Some believe that, or they just question, where does he get this particular power, and they don't understand, but they don't want to attribute it to anything specific. And some are just simply greatly amazed at the things that Jesus was able to do. And in the world today, there will be people who will read about the miracles of Jesus. They will share them with their children, even if they don't see them as something that was factual. There are people in the non-religious world, if you want to put it that way, but there are people in the world today that will go and that will look at the teachings and some of the miracles that Jesus performed, and because they are such amazing events, and in their minds amazing stories, not necessarily factual, they will actually share these things with their children or with other people because they find them to be amazing stories. And so again, this would have been a legitimate question to find out, hey, what are people saying? I've performed all these miracles. What is it that people are saying? Are they believing in who I am? Are they believing in where the power comes from? What are they saying about this particular power? Are they afraid of the power that I possess? Do they not understand? I mean, this particular question would have brought about a great deal of responses from his disciples. But again, that's not what he chooses to ask. And the third thing that we will discuss that Jesus did not ask, that would have been a very valid question at this particular time, is, what are people saying about my commands? Are they saying that they're not going to follow them? Are they saying that they are going to follow them? Are they saying that they don't like the commands that I have? Are they saying they don't agree with the commands that I have? Are they saying that I don't have the right to make these commands? What are people saying about my commands? What is their reaction? And again, certainly this would have stirred up a great deal of thought and a great deal of conversation. And we know that Jesus presented very many commands in his time spent teaching and healing the crowds. So you would have this vast array of responses. Some would want to follow them. Some would want to completely ignore them. Some would think that they were a good idea. Some would think that they were a bad idea. I mean, there's this whole array of responses that would have come out of the commands that Jesus presented to the people that they heard during the time of his teaching and time of his healing. And people throughout the world today will share teachings from the Sermon on the Mount, whether they believe that Jesus is the Christ or not. They'll share some of the commands and some of the ideas that he puts forth, not because they believe that he is Jesus Christ, but because they believe that it's a good idea, that you should listen to these particular teachings, or these particular commands are commands that you should live by. The one thing that popped into my head after I put this together and was delivering it on the Sunday past a couple weeks ago was the idea that people like the idea and the teaching of Jesus Christ as it pertains to the golden rule and how we treat others and how we should treat others. And many people will teach that as a command to live by, a way that you must live by, but they won't necessarily say that Jesus is the Christ. They won't necessarily say that Jesus is the Son of God or that Jesus is who he claims to be, other than maybe a good teacher, maybe, a great teacher, but they may not recognize him as who he claims. And so we've kind of looked at some things that he didn't ask, and I want to get to the point of why this is a good exercise. And as one writer put it, and we're going to look at, and I'm sorry that I don't have the author's name to directly quote, but I want to share this with you. It's been said that Jesus made the question of who he was absolutely central to his miracles, to his teaching, and to his commands, as well as everything that he did and said on this earth. So all of those particular questions are summed up in who he is. Who he is will determine how people view his miracles. Who he is will determine how people view his teachings. Who he is will determine what his commands mean. And so that's really why there wasn't a need to focus on those things, because the central point of who he is resonates into everything that he does. Someone once said, you can remove Muhammad from his teaching, and you still have the basic tenets of Islam. You can remove Confucius from his principles, and you would still have Confucianism. You can remove the Buddha from his instructions, and you still have Buddhism. You can remove almost every great philosopher in history from his or her philosophic principles, and you would still leave their philosophic system intact. To think about that for a second, the idea is that you can remove the key person associated with these ideas and they remain intact. But if you remove Christ from Christianity, you no longer have Christianity, because Jesus made his own identity the central theme of all that he thought, all that he did, and all that he commanded. And so that's why he's going to ask the questions that he's going to ask that we're looking at in this particular lesson and the one that followed it. So, what he did ask, he asked his disciples, who do men say that I am? And then we have various responses. In Mark chapter 6 and verse 14, now King Herod heard of him, for his name had become well known, and he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. So we know that at least Herod claimed that Jesus was simply John the Baptist risen from the dead. Some said that it was Elijah. In Malachi chapter 4 and verse 5, this is where they get this idea from. The prophecy says, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And so many people thought that Jesus was this was this Elijah who had been prophesied to come before the Lord. And they get that from their understanding of Malachi. In Matthew chapter 16 and verse 14, we see that some thought that he was Jeremiah. So they said, some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. So a great teacher, certainly. They're certainly acknowledging him and saying that he is somebody that is important, maybe somebody that is a former prophet, or maybe one who is a prophet returned. They're saying that he is a very good man. And this idea of one of the prophets, and kind of this concept, like Moses, Jesus declared the law of God. He was like one of the prophets. And like Isaiah, who was one of the prophets, Jesus preached about holiness and sacrifice. And just like the prophet Daniel, the message of Jesus is a prophetic message of a coming king and his kingdom. Like Jeremiah, Jesus' ministry was one of compassion and one of brokenness. And like Hosea, Jesus loved the unlovable and desired to redeem the wretched lost sinner. And so we have all of these answers as to who it is that men say that Jesus is. And so it would be interesting to look at the question of, you see that there are several different responses, then what would the response be today if that question were asked? Well, the Muslims would say that Jesus is a prophet, but he wasn't crucified on a cross, and he will return, but he's not God. The Hindus, they believe that Jesus is just one of millions of gods. The Jews believe that Jesus was a great prophet and teacher, but not God. And so all of them have this idea of something special, but not God. The Jehovah's Witnesses believe that Jesus was once the Archangel Michael before he came to the earth. In their view, he is not God in the flesh. The atheist denies Jesus ever existed at all. The agnostic doesn't know what to believe about Jesus. The agnostic, he hears all of these different things and he hears all these possibilities and he just doesn't know what to say. Most of society would say that Jesus was a great teacher, that he had some good ideas about loving our fellow man and being good to others, but they will not believe that he is the Savior or that he is God in the flesh. This is the most prevalent view of who Jesus is. His existence is acknowledged, but there is refusal to bow to his authority or give him the worship that he deserves. So there are answers to this particular question, and there are many different answers to this particular question. But this wasn't the only question that Jesus had for his disciples, and this wasn't the finishing of where he was trying to take them and what he wanted to teach them. And this particular question that follows was studied in the previous lesson that was presented. And I encourage you to go back and look at that answer once again to find out who do the disciples say Jesus is, and the importance of that particular question and its answer. Thank you.